My uncle was the kind of man who never threw anything away. That sounds like a harmless quirk until you're standing in the middle of his property in rural Vermont, staring at a farmhouse that hasn't had a living soul inside it for 11 years, wondering why every window is covered from the inside with newspaper dated 1987. I got the call on a Tuesday in late October. A lawyer named Mr. Fenwick, soft-spoken, the kind of voice that belonged on a classical radio station, told me my uncle had passed 3 weeks earlier, quietly, in a hospice facility outside Burlington. No announcement, no service. His instructions were explicit. No funeral, no obituary, no flowers. Just a phone call to me, his only living nephew, informing me that I had inherited everything. Everything turned out to be 42 acres of land, a farmhouse, 2 collapsed outbuildings, and back property taxes totaling just under $19,000. I remember sitting at my kitchen table in Pittsburgh after that call, holding a lukewarm cup of coffee and doing the kind of math that makes your stomach drop. I was 28 years old. I had a job I was decent at. Junior project manager at a regional construction firm, a decent apartment, and a car that needed new brakes. What I did not have was $19,000. My girlfriend at the time, Mara, sat across from me and said, very practically, you could just sign it over. Walk away clean. She wasn't wrong. Estates can be disclaimed. I looked it up that same night. You have 9 months to file a disclaimer, and the property passes on as if you'd predeceased the original owner. No debt, no obligation, no 42 acres of frozen Vermont farmland I'd never even visited. Here's the thing about my uncle, though. I need to explain who he was before I explain what I found. His name was Cecil Marsh. He was my mother's older brother by 14 years, more of a generation gap than a sibling gap, and for most of my childhood he existed only as a Christmas card and the occasional phone call that my mother always took in the kitchen with the door closed. When I was 9, I asked her why Uncle Cecil never visited. She said he preferred his own company. When I was 16, I asked again. She said some people choose a different kind of life, and that we should respect that. He came to her funeral when I was 23. That was the only time I ever met him in person. He was tall and thin, with gray hair he hadn't bothered to cut in what looked like years, and he shook my hand at the reception and said, "Your mother was the best person I ever knew. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Then he drove back to Vermont the same night. I don't know why, but that stayed with me, the way he said it. Not like a eulogy line, like something he'd been holding for a long time and finally found the right moment to set down. So when Mr. Fenwick called, I didn't disclaim. I drove up instead. The property was about 40 minutes east of Burlington, down a 2-lane state route that turned to gravel about a mile before the way. I went up on a Friday in November, planning to stay the weekend, take some photos, assess the situation. The air up there had that particular Vermont cold, not bitter yet, but serious. The kind that reminds you winter is not a metaphor up here. The farmhouse was older than I expected. 2 stories, white clapboard that had gone the color of old teeth, a covered porch that sagged on the left side. The lawn, if you could call it that, was mostly dead grass and the skeletal remains of what had once been a serious vegetable garden. Raised beds, now just frames of rotting 2x4s. My uncle had grown things here. That surprised me. The front door was unlocked, not just unlocked, it swung open when I pushed it, like it had been expecting me. Inside smelled like cedar and something older underneath. Something I couldn't name. Not mold exactly. More like the smell of a library that hasn't ordered new books in 30 years. I spent the first few hours just walking through. The house was fuller than I expected. My uncle hadn't thrown things away, but he also hadn't been a hoarder in the chaotic sense. Everything was organized. Carefully, obsessively even. The kitchen had labeled canisters. The shelves had labeled jars. His bedroom had a single bed made up so tightly you could have bounced a quarter off it. The room that had clearly been his study was lined floor to ceiling with bookshelves, a massive oak desk in the center, and a wood stove in the corner that still had ash in it. On the desk was a sealed envelope with my name on it. Not my full name. Just Marsh Boy, which is what he'd called me at my mother's funeral, I realized. Not my name. Marsh boy. Like he'd decided I belonged to the land the same way he did. I opened it standing right there at the desk. The letter inside was 2 pages, handwritten in the kind of precise, cramped script you don't see from people who grew up with keyboards. It started, "By the time you read this, I imagine you've already considered selling. That's fine. That's sensible. But I'm asking you to spend 1 week here first. Not for sentiment. There's something I need you to find." He didn't say what. He said I'd know it when I found it. He said the house had a logic to it, and if I paid attention, the logic would lead me there. He said I couldn't tell you while I was alive, because I didn't know who might be watching. I know how that sounds. I know you have no reason to trust me. But your mother trusted me with something once, and I never broke that. I'm asking you to extend me the same courtesy. I read that letter 3 times. Then I folded it, put it in my jacket pocket, and started paying attention. The first 2 days I found nothing unusual. I went through drawers, opened boxes, looked behind paintings. I told myself I was being thorough. Really, I was starting to feel like an idiot, wandering around a dead man's house looking for a sign. On Sunday night, I almost packed up and left. Monday morning, I was in the study when I knocked my knee hard into the corner of the desk and swore loud enough to startle myself. I stood there, hopping slightly, and when I looked down at the floor, I noticed something I'd been walking over all weekend without registering. The floorboards in the study didn't match the rest of the house. In every other room, the wood ran east-west. In the study, it ran north-south. I'd noticed it the first day and filed it away as nothing, a renovation, a repair. But standing there with my knee throbbing, I actually looked at it. The boards were slightly newer. Not new, weathered to look old, but newer. And in the far corner, behind the wood stove, one of the boards had a grain pattern that ran the wrong direction. I moved the wood stove. It was cast iron and heavy enough that I had to brace myself against the wall to get it to budge. Underneath it, the floor was clean. No ash, no grime, which meant the stove had been moved regularly, and the board with the wrong grain had a small iron ring recessed into a slot in the wood, almost invisible unless the light caught it exactly right. I pulled the ring. The board came up, and underneath it was a simple latch. I undid the latch. A section of flooring about 2 feet by 3 feet hinged upward, and underneath was a set of wooden stairs descending into darkness. I stood at the top of those stairs for a long moment. I want to be honest about this part. I was scared. Not in a dramatic way. Just the quiet, practical fear of a person standing at the edge of something they don't understand. I got my phone out, turned on the flashlight, and went down. The space below was a room. A real room, not a crawl space, not a root cellar. The ceiling was low enough that I had to duck slightly, but it ran the entire footprint of the study above, maybe 14 by 16 feet. The walls were stone, old fieldstone, the kind that gets laid without mortar and holds anyway through sheer stubbornness. And the room was not empty. Along the left wall, metal shelving units, the industrial kind you find in warehouses, lined with cardboard file boxes. Every box labeled, in my uncle's handwriting, with dates and initials. The earliest went back to 1991. The most recent was dated 8 months ago. Along the right wall, a workbench with a lamp, a small safe bolted to the floor, and a corkboard above it covered in photographs, documents, handwritten notes connected by pieces of red string. I stood in the middle of that room with my phone flashlight and said, out loud, to no one, "What were you doing, Cecil?" I spent 3 hours down there the first time. I didn't open the safe. I didn't know the combination. But I read what was on the corkboard, and I went through enough of the file boxes to start understanding the shape of it. My uncle had been documenting something for 30 years, methodically, quietly, with the patience of a man who had nowhere else to be. The photographs were of buildings, mostly, properties. A grain storage facility outside a town called Haverford, about 60 miles north. A self-storage complex just off Interstate 89. A warehouse near the Canadian border that appeared in multiple photos across different years, different seasons, and then, in one photograph clipped to the center of the board, a man I didn't recognize, standing outside what looked like a county municipal building, shaking hands with another man whose face was partially obscured. Below the photo, in my uncle's handwriting, Alderman K. and Whitfield. March 2019. Third meeting, I pulled out the letter again and read the last paragraph, the one I'd glossed over the first few times. There is a man in Haverford County who has been stealing from this community for a long time. Not with a gun, with paperwork. I have the proof. I couldn't go to the police because two of the people in those files are law enforcement. I couldn't go to a lawyer because the man controls a lot of the local money, and people in those towns protect what feeds them. But you're not from here. You don't owe anyone anything. That's why it has to be you. I sat down on the stone floor of that basement room and stayed there for a while. Here's what I found. Across the next 4 days, my uncle had spent 3 decades watching a property developer named Whitfield quietly buy up agricultural land in Haverford County through a shell company called Meridian Land Holdings. The purchases were legal on their face, but they weren't arm's-length transactions. Whitfield had a relationship with the county alderman who controlled zoning variance approvals, a man named Kinsey. Kinsey would approve variances on properties Whitfield wanted. Property owners who refused to sell found their variance requests denied, their permits delayed, their assessments mysteriously revised upward. The pressure was subtle and sustained. Most people eventually sold. My uncle had been one of the holdouts. He'd bought his 42 acres in 1989 for $70,000. Meridian Land Holdings had made 3 purchase offers over the years, each time using an intermediary. My uncle had refused each one. He'd also spent those same years watching what happened to his neighbors, taking photos, keeping records, filing his own FOIA requests on zoning decisions, and cross-referencing them with property sales. The file boxes were the record, 30 years of it. Names, dates, transaction records, correspondence he'd obtained copies of through various means I couldn't entirely reconstruct. And in the small safe, which I opened on Thursday when I found the combination written in the back of a field guide to Vermont birds on the study bookshelf, 3614-9, circled in red ink, were the originals, signed documents, a set of what appeared to be financial records showing payments from a Meridian subsidiary to an account that traced back to Alderman Kinsey's brother-in-law. I sat with those documents, spread out on my uncle's workbench, and understood why he couldn't move while he was alive. He was one man, on 42 acres, with no money and no connections. If he'd surfaced this while Whitfield was still operating, the documents might have disappeared, or he might have. He wasn't being paranoid. He was being careful, but he was also dying. And he had held this for 30 years, and he didn't want it to die with him. What he wanted, what his letter made clear in that final paragraph, was for someone younger, someone with no ties to Haverford County, to take what was in those boxes to a journalist. Not the police. Not a lawyer. A journalist. I drove home to Pittsburgh that Thursday night, with the safe's contents in a locked document bag on the passenger seat of my car. I did not sleep well. I kept checking my mirrors on the highway in a way I'm not entirely proud of, and I made 2 unnecessary lane changes just to see if anyone followed. Back home, I spent a week doing research. I found a reporter at a Vermont-based investigative outlet who had written 2 previous pieces on county-level zoning corruption in New England. I reached out through the outlet's tip line, kept my name out of it initially, described what I had in general terms. She called me within 48 hours. Her name was Ms. Alderton. She was thorough in a way that felt almost aggressive at first. She asked me to verify every document, explain every link in the chain, account for gaps. She also told me, about halfway through our second call, that Meridian Land Holdings had already been on her radar for a different reason. A source of hers had mentioned the company name in connection with a federal rural development grant that hadn't been properly administered. What my uncle had was the local piece of a larger pattern. I want to tell you the next part was simple. It wasn't. It took 7 months. There was a moment, about 4 months in, when a man I didn't recognize drove past my apartment building twice in 1 week, and I moved in with a friend in Shadyside for 2 weeks just to be cautious. There was a moment when Ms. Alderton told me the story was getting complicated, and she wasn't sure her editor would run it, and I sat in my car in a parking garage in downtown Pittsburgh and thought very seriously about whether any of this was worth it. I thought about Cecil, about the way he'd shaken my hand at my mother's funeral and said she was the best person he ever knew. About the fact that he'd spent 30 years, alone, in a farmhouse in Vermont, keeping a record of something that mattered because no one else was. I went back up to the farmhouse that weekend. I needed to think, and something about the place had started to feel like it belonged to me, which I hadn't expected. I walked the property for the first time. All 42 acres. It took the better part of the day. There were 2 ponds, one larger than I'd expected, with a beaver dam that looked recently reinforced. There was a stand of sugar maples on the eastern edge, old ones, the kind that take 60 years to produce well. There was a collapsed fence line along the northern boundary where the land had once been divided from the neighboring farm. I stood at the edge of the property, looking north into the tree line, and understood something I couldn't quite articulate. My uncle had held this land the way you hold a position. Not because it was comfortable. Because it meant something. Because giving it up would have meant something too. I paid the back taxes, $19,000. I took it from my savings and a personal loan from my credit union, and it wiped me out nearly clean, but I paid it. I filed the paperwork to formalize the inheritance. I started looking into what it would cost to fix the porch. Miss Alderton's story ran 11 months after I first contacted her, in a joint publication with a regional newspaper that had partnered with her outlet. It was long, 14,000 words. It named Whitfield. It named Alderman Kinsey. It documented the shell company structure, the payments, the coordinated pressure campaign. It described, without naming me, how the records had come to light following the death of a longtime holdout property owner in Haverford County. Whitfield's attorneys issued a statement within 24 hours, calling the story defamatory and announcing plans to sue. The lawsuit was filed 6 weeks later. It was dropped 8 months after that, after federal prosecutors announced they were opening an inquiry into Meridian Land Holdings' involvement with the misappropriated grant funds. Kinsey did not seek re-election. 2 other county officials named in follow-up reporting resigned within the year. I don't know what my uncle expected when he sealed that envelope with my name on it. I think he might have expected me to disclaim the estate, sign away the land, and forget about it. I think he might have expected even less of me than I expected of myself. But I think he also knew my mother, and he knew what she'd raised. And maybe that was the whole gamble. The farmhouse took 2 years and more money than I want to admit to get livable. I did a lot of the work myself, which I won't pretend was efficient but was, in ways I didn't anticipate, necessary. There's something about putting your hands into a place that makes it yours in a way that paperwork doesn't. I live up here full-time now. I kept the job, remote, which the company agreed to when I made the case, and I run the property on weekends. The sugar maples produced last March, and I made more syrup than any one person could reasonably consume. I gave most of it away. The porch is solid now. I fixed the fence line. There's a photograph on the desk in the study, Cecil's desk, which I kept, taken at my mother's funeral. It's the only photo I've ever seen of my uncle and my mother together as adults. They're standing in the church parking lot, not looking at the camera. He's saying something. She's listening with her head tilted slightly, the way she always did when someone was telling her something important. I don't know what he was saying. I never will, but I think I understand now why she always took his calls in the kitchen with the door closed. Some conversations are private, not because they're shameful, but because they matter too much for an audience. He held that secret for 30 years. I held it for 11 months. Between the two of us, we kept his word. That's the only inheritance that counts.